Halloween every day, the dark side of Victorian post-mortem photos. Welcome to Explore and Discover Curious World. Ever wondered what it was like to live in a time when death wasn't just a part of life, but a prime subject of family photos? Today, we're diving into one of the most eccentric, and let's face it, creepy practices of the Victorian era, post-mortem photography. Just think about it. Today, we snap photos of everything and everyone. But for our Victorian ancestors, a photo was rare, precious, and sometimes the only way to remember a loved one who passed on. In a time when surviving a cold could be a miracle, a simple photograph could become the final selfie of a person's life. So welcome to the dark world of post-mortem photography, a macabre but fascinating place where death and immortality meet in front of a camera lens. Ready to dive in? Part 1. Victorian life between disease and superstition. Imagine living in a time when almost anything could kill you. Welcome to Victorian England. Typhus, cholera, diphtheria. If you were a working-class male in London, your life expectancy was a grand total of 22 years. Maybe it sounds unbelievable today, but if you made it past 30, you were basically a survivor. And women, they might have lived a bit longer, but it was hardly easier. They faced relentless pregnancies and backbreaking work. The romantic, Victorian era, living among soot and open sewers, made winter feel like a real-life Halloween. So it's no surprise that death was practically a constant companion. Families were constantly exposed to the idea of the afterlife, just like we are to memes on social media today. But their version of dark humor was decidedly more macabre. Death wasn't a taboo, it was everyday conversation. And so when a loved one passed, they'd take a nice commemorative photo. Sounds creepy? Well, to them, it was just a way to handle grief. Yet, Part 2, mourning culture in the Victorian era, when black was always in fashion. Speaking of mourning, let's talk about Queen Victoria, the ultimate dark icon. When her husband Albert died, she decided to embrace black as her mourning color. For 40 years, she dressed in black daily, kept the house as if Albert was still there, complete with his clothes laid out and bed neatly made, and even had hot water prepared for his morning shave. To this day, black clothing at funerals in the UK is sort of a tribute to this tradition that she started. And the people followed suit. Although life was short, mourning could last for years. Families talked openly about funeral wishes. Widows wore black for years, and black became all the rage. Some Victorians practically became professional mourners, planning their own funerals and leaving detailed instructions on what to do when their time would come. So here's why post-mortem photos made sense in this context. Families wanted to remember their loved ones forever, and one way to do that was to immortalize them with a photograph. Photos were expensive, but much cheaper than a portrait. So this visual memento became a precious way to preserve memories. Part 3. The origin of post-mortem photography, an almost accessible practice. So how did post-mortem photography even start? It all began with the invention of the daguerreotype, the first widely accessible photographic process. The daguerreotype made it possible to get clear images without needing a painting, so more people could afford a remembrance of their loved ones who had passed on. The practice of post-mortem photography became so popular that no Victorian home was complete without at least one hanging on the wall. The image of the deceased became a sacred object, a way to soften the pain of loss. And for some, it really was the only visual memory of their loved one, as many hadn't had the chance to take any photos while they were alive. But why did these images need to look alive? Simple. Representing the deceased as asleep or engaged in some everyday activity gave the illusion of eternal life. And so, with artistic poses and photographic tricks, photographers of the era did their best to make their subjects look, well, less deceased than they actually were. Part 4. Staging the photos. How to prep a deceased loved one for a photo. Post-mortem photography was practically a ritual. The deceased would be dressed in nice clothes, their hair carefully styled, and if necessary, certain techniques would be used to keep their eyes open. Think about it. In an era when smiling was rare, a solemn pose was almost mandatory. Sometimes flowers, symbols of death, or even clocks were placed around the deceased to represent the end of time. And the children? This is where things get even more unsettling. Children were often depicted with toys, pets, or posed as if they were in a peaceful sleep. These portraits were meant to comfort the grieving parents, but let's be honest, they look decidedly eerie from today's perspective. Here's another fun fact about the time. To make the cheeks of the deceased look more lively, photographers would color the photo slightly, giving the skin a soft pink glow. Some even painted eyes onto the negatives to give the deceased one last glance toward eternity. So, busting the myth, were they really standing in those photos? Maybe you've heard that deceased Victorians were photographed standing, held up by pedestals or special stands. Actually, they weren't. Those stands were only for the living, since it was tricky to stay still for long exposure times back then. A tiny movement could ruin the photo, so the living were literally anchored with these stands. If a subject is perfectly in focus, there's a good chance they weren't breathing. Part 6, the decline of post-mortem photography and its legacy. As time went on and customs evolved, post-mortem photos became less popular. After the 1940s, these images mostly showed the deceased in their coffins, no longer posed as if they were alive. But the practice hasn't completely disappeared. Even today, in some cultures, people still take photos to remember the deceased as one last gesture of love and memory. In fact, there are even charity organizations today that provide free photography services to parents who have lost a child, offering them a lasting memory of their little one. It reminds us that even though times and contexts change, the desire to keep a tangible memory of a loved one is something universal. Yeah, conclusion and call to action. And with that, we've reached the end of this dark yet fascinating journey through the Victorian era, a time when death was as much a part of daily life as social media is for us today. What do you think about this strange habit of post-mortem photography? Does it seem loving or downright creepy? Let us know in the comments. And if you love oddities and curiosities from around the world, remember to subscribe to Explore and Discover Curious World so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Here, you'll always find fascinating and mysterious stories from the past and present. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed this historical deep dive, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. See you next time, and happy Halloween every day of the year. And that wraps up our deep dive into the eerie world of Victorian post-mortem photography, a strange yet captivating journey through a time when death was as much a part of life as, well, taking selfies is today. Now I'm curious, what do you think about this Victorian habit? Heartwarming or just plain spooky? Let us know in the comments. And hey, if there's a specific topic you'd like us to explore, drop it in the comments too. We love hearing your ideas and bringing the weirdest, most curious stories from around the world straight to you. So don't forget to like, subscribe to Explore and Discover Curious World, and hit that bell to make sure you're here for the next bizarre journey. See you next time, and happy Halloween every day of the year.